What up, y'all? It's your man, Abuamerican. Hey, I just wanted to read a passage to you from something I experienced yesterday with my argument from the PhD that I was talking about. And it's very, very relevant to the point that I almost thought about sending it to her. But I don't think she'd read it or, agree. But it is something that I've noticed as a consistent behavior whenever women are introduced to red pill ideology, where I say that men and women have different lives. Now, get this. I never read this before today. Yet and still, this was something I was saying to that PhD before I even read it. It goes like this: experience. And this is on page 186 of The Rational Male Preventative Medicine. And he says, women become very indignant when trying to understand the male experience. This is due in most part to women's innate solipsism and their presumption that their experience is a universal one. Part of this presumption is due to social reinforcement, but that social presumption, essentially the equalist presumption, is rooted in women's base indifference to anything external that doesn't affect them directly and personally. If everyone is essentially the same and equal, and we're acculturated to encourage this perspective, it leaves women to interpret their own imperatives and innate solipsism to be the normative ones for men. So, it often comes with a lot of shock and indignation, which women instinctively crave, when women are forced, sometimes rudely, to acknowledge that men's experience doesn't reflect their own. Now, let's cover that right there. The entire point of the conversation we were having, or not the entire point, excuse me, but one of the things we were discussing was like just the in basic differences between men and women in general, and how we have different lives accordingly. And she couldn't believe that. She tried to relate, like, that gender is a construct and our lives are exactly the same, and they're mirrored in the same way. And I had to bring multiple examples as to how this is incorrect. And eventually it just came to the point where she was just being obtuse and like disagreeing just because she didn't want me to be right, but she knew I was. You could see it in her face. Carrying on. The reactive responses to force fit men's experience into women's self-centered or self-concerned interpretations of what that experience should be according to the feminine primary perception of what works best for women. On an individual woman's level, this amounts to denial and rejection of a legitimate male primary experience through shame or implied femcentric obligations to accept and adopt her experience as his responsibility. On a social level, this conflict is reflected in social conventions and feminine-centric social doctrines, as well as being written directly into binding laws that forcibly enact feminine-centric perspectives into our social fabric. And this is basically the foundation of the men's rights movement. Feminine solipsism and the primacy of the female experience superseding the male experience begins with the individual woman, micro, and extrapolates into feminine primary social construct, macro. Virtually every conflict between the sexes comes back to the rejection of the legitimacy of the male experience. And I faced this so many times. You know how much I face this? Just read the comment sections on some of my most controversial videos. Even some of the ones that aren't very controversial. Look who comments the most and the most vehemently against them. If you were on my Facebook, oh my gosh. In every social and psychological dynamic I've ever written about, it is the fundamental lack of understanding of the male experience which influences women's perception of our sex. Whether it is understanding our sexual impulse, our idealistic concept of love, or appreciating the sacrifices men uniquely make to facilitate the feminine reality, the disconnect always distills down to a fundamental lack of accepting the legitimacy of the male experience. It would be too easy to cop out to simply write this disconnect off as an existential difference. Obviously, men and women cannot spend time in each other's skin to directly appreciate the experience of the other. However, since the feminine imperative is the normative one in our current social makeup, the presumption is that a feminine-directed equalism is the only legitimate experience. Thus, the masculine experience is by default delegitimized, if not vilified, for simply reminding the feminine that inherent evolved sexual differences challenge equalism by masculinity's very presence. Gentlemen, this is the reality we live in. If you embrace masculinity, if you embrace red pill ideology, know for sure you have embraced the social equivalents of being a Sith Lord. You are one of the Dark Lords of the Apocalypse. You will be the bad guy. And let me tell you something. For the most part, women and men alike, they are going to love you for it. Most of them. Most of them. You're going to face a lot of resistance. But in the back of their minds, especially women, if you're firm about it, if you're articulate about it, they're going to love you. They'll resist you. But trust me. This is your man, Abuamerican. Catch me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, all at Abuamerican. I'm out.